Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving into something super relevant, especially if you're following what's happening with tech regulation in Europe, which you are.
Absolutely.
They are on a roll right now, trying to get ahead of the game, shaping how tech impacts society, and they're doing some really interesting things.
Yeah, it's exciting to see.
We're talking about, can you actually bake legal and ethical principles into the very DNA of technology? That's what law by design is all about, and that's what we're going to unpack today.
It's a fascinating concept, for sure.
It really is. So let's start with the basics. For anyone who's new to this whole law by design thing,
Sure.
what exactly are we talking about here?
Well, in a nutshell, it's about integrating legal principles into the very process of designing technology, not just slapping on rules after the fact.
So it's not like, okay, you built it, now make it comply with the law.
Exactly. It's more like, let's think about the law from the very beginning, even before a single line of code is written.
I see. So it's less about specific regulations and more about a mindset shift.
Yeah, exactly. A good analogy might be security by design. You've probably heard that term before.
Yeah, definitely. It's about building security in from the ground up.
Exactly. It's not about demanding a laundry list of security features. It's about making security a core consideration at every stage of development.
So with law by design, it's like setting a destination and some guiding principles, but leaving room for flexibility and creativity in how you get there, which seems pretty crucial in the tech world because things change so rapidly.
Absolutely. And that's actually what makes this approach so different and I think so promising. It's about setting a goal instead of giving a rigid set of instructions. And that's really important in the fast-paced world of technology where innovation is key.
Right, because who knows what we'll be inventing 5 years from now, let alone 10 or 20 years down the line. But is this actually happening, or is it more of a lofty idea?
Oh, it's definitely happening. And what's amazing is how widespread this law by design concept is becoming in European legislation. And it goes way beyond just privacy and data protection, which is where it kind of started.
Wait, beyond privacy? I thought GDPR was the main event when it came to law by design.
It was a big one for sure, but it was just the first step, really, the tip of the iceberg. We're actually talking over 45 different design goals that European lawmakers are trying to bake into technology.
45? Are you serious? I mean, that's incredible. So besides privacy, what else is on the table?
I mean, you name it, they're probably thinking about it. Sustainability is a big one, making sure tech is developed and used in a way that doesn't trash the planet.
Right, makes sense.
Accessibility is another huge one, making sure everyone can benefit from technology regardless of any disabilities they might have.
Of course, that's essential.
And then you've got gender equality, making sure technology doesn't perpetuate existing biases, and open data practices, promoting transparency and data sharing, and even guidelines for AI, which is a whole other can of worms.
Wow. They're really trying to shape the future of tech in a big way. I mean, it's ambitious, to say the least.
It really is. It shows that lawmakers are starting to grasp just how much technology touches every single aspect of our lives.
And they want to make sure it's a positive force, not a negative one,
Exactly. And that it reflects our values as a society.
which is a whole other conversation in itself. But let's maybe park that for a moment and come back to the how. How do you even begin to put law by design into action? I mean, it can't be as simple as telling developers, hey, just be ethical, right?
You're right. It's definitely more complicated than that. It's about weaving those ethical considerations into the design process itself, making them an integral part of how technology is actually built.
So how do you do that?
Well, one of the key steps is assessing the potential impact of a technology before a single line of code is written.
So like a risk assessment, but for ethics.
Exactly. A sort of pre-mortem for tech, if you will.
I like that, a pre-mortem for tech. So you're looking for ethical pitfalls before they even happen. And I'm guessing this is where things can get a little bit tricky, because sometimes those ethical considerations might clash with each other or with other priorities, like functionality or cost.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where it becomes crucial to find creative solutions, to think outside the box and find ways to reconcile those potentially conflicting goals.
Can you give us an example? Like, what does this look like in practice?
Sure. So let's say you're developing a new traffic monitoring system. Seems pretty straightforward, right? But even something like that raises ethical questions.
Like what? I mean, how complicated can counting cars really be?
Well, think about it. How do you count cars while still respecting people's privacy? Do you use facial recognition? What about license plate readers? What happens to all that data? Who has access to it?
Right, so it's not just about counting cars, it's about collecting data on people's movements,
Yeah.
which has all sorts of privacy implications.
Exactly. And that's where law by design comes in. It's about anticipating those ethical dilemmas and finding solutions that align with the desired legal principles.
So in the case of traffic monitoring, how do you square that circle? How do you count cars without compromising people's privacy?
Well, one solution that's being explored is using thermal cameras instead of traditional ones. They can still detect and count vehicles, but they capture far less personally identifiable information.
That's clever.
Yeah.
It's like you're still achieving the main goal, counting the cars, but you're doing it in a way that's much more privacy friendly.
Exactly. And that's a great example of how considering legal principles up front can actually lead to more innovative and elegant solutions.
It's not just about imposing restrictions, it's about sparking creativity.
Exactly. And it's not always about finding the perfect solution, because often there isn't one. It's about navigating those gray areas, those messy intersections of different values, and finding a workable balance. And that's where this concept of proportionality becomes really important.
Okay, proportionality. Now there's a word I haven't heard in a while. Break that one down for me.
Sure. So in the context of law by design, proportionality essentially means weighing different values against each other and finding an acceptable compromise. It's about acknowledging that you can't always have everything you want, and sometimes you need to make trade-offs.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, let's take content moderation on social media. That's a hot topic these days.
Huge.
You've got freedom of speech on one hand, which is obviously incredibly important, but you've also got the need to limit the spread of harmful content, like hate speech or misinformation, which can have real-world consequences.
Right. It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot where you're not stifling free expression, but you're also protecting people from harm.
Precisely. And that's where proportionality comes in. It's about finding that sweet spot, maximizing the benefits while minimizing the harms.
Which I imagine is often easier said than done, right?
Oh, absolutely. It requires careful consideration, context-specific judgments, and often a lot of back and forth. There's no magic formula, unfortunately.
It sounds like law by design is all about collaboration. You need engineers, legal experts, ethicists, all working together to figure this stuff out.
Absolutely. And that's another key aspect of this whole approach, collaboration. It recognizes that you can't expect tech developers to become legal experts overnight, or vice versa.
Right. It's about bringing different kinds of expertise to the table.
Exactly. And that's where knowledge governance comes in.
Oh, knowledge governance. Okay, now you're just throwing big words at me. What does that even mean?
It's actually a really important piece of this puzzle. Essentially, knowledge governance is about creating systems and structures to share best practices, guidelines, and research related to law by design. It's about making sure that everyone involved in developing and deploying technology has access to the information they need to make ethically sound decisions.
So it's like building an infrastructure for ethical tech development.
Exactly. It's about creating a shared understanding of what law by design means in practice and providing the tools and resources to actually implement it effectively.
And what does that look like in practice? I mean, how do you actually do knowledge governance?
We're seeing all sorts of interesting initiatives popping up, from industry-specific guidelines and standards to pan-European research projects and knowledge-sharing platforms. There are even dedicated institutions being created specifically to support law by design and knowledge governance in this field.
So it's a whole ecosystem that's being built around this idea.
Precisely. And it's still early days, but it's exciting to see this level of commitment to building a more ethical and values-driven tech landscape.
It really is. It's like Europe is trying to write the rule book for the future of technology.
And not just for Europe, but potentially for the whole world.
That's a great point, because even though this is all happening in Europe, it has implications for everyone, everywhere, right? I mean, we've already seen that with GDPR.
Absolutely.
Right.
What happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe, especially when it comes to tech.
Right. Because if Europe sets the standard, the rest of the world tends to follow, at least to some extent.
Exactly. And the potential impact of law by design could be even bigger than GDPR. We're talking about the potential for more ethical technology, more resilient systems, and maybe even entirely new waves of innovation.
That's a pretty bold claim. I mean, can law by design really live up
Yeah.
to all that hype?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And of course, there are no guarantees, but what's exciting is that Europe is at least trying to be proactive. They're not just reacting to problems after they blow up, they're trying to anticipate them and steer things in a better direction from the get-go. And that, I think, is worth paying attention to, no matter where you are in the world.
I completely agree. It can't be as simple as telling developers, hey, just be ethical. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, there's got to be more to it than that, right?
Absolutely. You're spot on. It's about baking those ethical considerations into the design process itself right from the start.
So how does that actually work?
Well, one of the key things is before you even write a single line of code, you got to assess the potential impact of that technology.
So you're saying it's like a risk assessment. But instead of looking for financial risks or technical glitches, you're looking for ethical pitfalls.
Exactly. Like a pre-mortem for tech, if you will.
I like that. A pre-mortem for tech. I'm going to steal that one. So you're trying to catch those ethical dilemmas before they even have a chance to become real-world problems.
Precisely. It's about thinking ahead, anticipating those unintended consequences that can arise when you're not paying attention to the ethical implications of what you're building.
Okay, so let's say you've done your ethical pre-mortem and you've identified some potential conflicts, some areas where those ethical considerations might clash with each other or with other priorities.
Sure.
What happens then?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting, because that's where you have to get creative and find solutions that can reconcile those competing goals. It's not always easy, but it's definitely where a law by design can really shine.
Can you give us an example? Like, what would that look like in a real-world scenario?
Sure. I read this fascinating example about traffic monitoring systems.
Okay, traffic monitoring. Sounds pretty straightforward.
Right, you would think so. But even something as seemingly simple as counting cars can raise a whole host of ethical questions.
Really? Like, how complicated can counting cars be?
Well, think about it. How do you actually count the cars? Do you use cameras with facial recognition? What about license plate readers? And what happens to all that data? Who has access to it? It's not just about counting cars anymore. It's about collecting data on people's movements, which has all sorts of privacy implications.
Right. Okay, I see where you're going with this.
It's a slippery slope, right?
It is. So in that case, like with the traffic monitoring, how do you balance those competing interests? How do you count the cars without turning every driver into a data point?
Well, one solution that's being explored is using thermal cameras instead of traditional ones. They can still detect and count vehicles, but they capture far less personally identifiable information.
That's interesting. It's like you're still achieving the main goal, counting the cars. But you're doing it in a way that's much more privacy friendly.
Exactly. And that's a perfect example of how considering legal principles up front can actually spark innovation and lead to more creative and elegant solutions.
I love that. So it's not about imposing restrictions. It's about like opening up new possibilities, new ways of thinking about the problem.
Exactly. And sometimes it's not even about finding the perfect solution, because in many cases there isn't one. It's about navigating those gray areas, those messy intersections of different values, and finding a workable balance. It's about compromise, essentially.
Which can be really tough, I imagine, especially when you've got so many different stakeholders with different priorities.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where this concept of proportionality comes in.
Proportionality. There's another one of those million-dollar words. Break that one down for me, would you?
Sure. So in the context of law by design, proportionality basically means weighing different values against each other and then trying to strike a balance, finding an acceptable compromise.
Okay, so it's like saying we can't always have it all, but we can try to find a solution that minimizes the harms while still achieving the desired benefits.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging those trade-offs and making informed decisions about which values to prioritize in a given situation.
Could you give us an example of how that works in practice?
Sure. A classic example is content moderation on social media platforms.
Oh, yeah, that's a hot topic if I've ever heard one.
It is, isn't it?
Uh,
And it perfectly illustrates this whole idea of proportionality. Because on the one hand, you've got freedom of speech, which is obviously a fundamental right that we want to protect. But on the other hand, you've got the very real harms that can be caused by things like hate speech, harassment, and misinformation.
Right, it's about finding that balance, right? Where you're not censoring legitimate speech, but you're also protecting people from real harm.
Exactly. And that's where proportionality comes in. It's about finding that sweet spot, that middle ground, where you're maximizing the benefits of free expression while minimizing the harms of harmful content.
Which is way easier said than done, I'm sure.
It really is. It requires a lot of nuance, a lot of context-specific judgment calls and a lot of ongoing dialogue and debate. But it's essential to get it right because the stakes are so high.
They really are. And it sounds like it takes a village to even begin to address these issues. I mean, you'd need lawyers, ethicists, engineers all working together.
Absolutely. And that's another really important aspect of this whole approach, collaboration.
Collaboration.
Yes. Because you can't expect tech developers to become legal experts overnight, right? And lawyers don't magically acquire deep technical knowledge just because they've read a few articles about AI.
Right. So it's about bringing different kinds of expertise to the table and finding ways to bridge those gaps in knowledge and perspective.
Exactly. And that's where knowledge governance comes in.
Knowledge governance.
Okay.
You're going to have to explain that one because I have no idea what that means.
It sounds fancy, but it's actually pretty simple. Basically, knowledge governance is about creating systems and structures to share information, best practices, guidelines, and research related to law by design. It's about making sure that everyone who's involved in the development and deployment of technology has access to the information they need to make ethically sound decisions.
So it's like building a knowledge base, a repository of ethical best practices for tech.
Exactly. And not just a static repository, but a dynamic, evolving system that can keep pace with the ever-changing landscape of technology and the ethical challenges it poses.
So this knowledge governance thing, it's like we're talking about building a whole ecosystem for ethical tech development, which is a huge undertaking.
It is a big task, but it's exciting and necessary, I think, if we want to make sure that technology is a force for good in the world.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the future we're talking about here, and it's being shaped right now as we speak.
Exactly, and that's why what Europe is doing is so interesting and potentially so impactful, because they're not just talking about these issues, they're actually putting concrete measures in place to address them.
Right. Like, they're not just thinking about it, they're actually doing something about it.
Yeah.
Which is more than I can say for a lot of other governments and institutions.
It's true, and I think that's why people are paying attention, even outside of Europe. Because this isn't just a European issue, it's a global one.
Exactly. And we've already seen how influential Europe can be in shaping global tech policy, like with GDPR.
Right. GDPR had a huge ripple effect around the world, even in countries that didn't have similar regulations in place.
Exactly. And I think law by design has the potential to be even more impactful because it's about something even more fundamental. It's about embedding ethical considerations into the very fabric of technology.
Exactly. It's about getting ahead of the curve, anticipating problems before they arise, instead of constantly playing catch-up, which is what we've been doing for far too long.
I agree. It's like we're always one step behind, trying to rein in the unintended consequences of technologies that were developed without enough foresight.
It's like we're building the plane while we're flying it, which is never a good idea.
Definitely not. But with law by design, it's like we're actually taking the time to design the plane properly before we even start building it.
Precisely. And that's a much more sustainable approach in the long run, both ethically and practically.
Absolutely. And it's not just about avoiding harm. It's about creating new possibilities, new opportunities for innovation that wouldn't even be conceivable if we weren't thinking about these ethical considerations from the very beginning.
I completely agree. It's about expanding the realm of what's possible, not just limiting the realm of what's permissible.
That's a great way to put it. So as we wrap up our deep dive today, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what the future holds for law by design. Do you think it has the potential to truly transform the tech landscape? Or are we getting ahead of ourselves?
Well, I'm an optimist by nature, so I'd like to believe that it does have the power to make a real difference. But I also think it's important to be realistic. This is a long game, and there will be challenges along the way. But the fact that we're even having this conversation, that governments, industry leaders, and citizens are all engaging in this debate, that gives me hope.
Me too. And I think that's what's so exciting about this moment in time. We have a real opportunity to shape the future of technology, to make sure that it reflects our values, our hopes, and our aspirations for a better world.
Absolutely. And I think that's something worth striving for, even if we don't have all the answers yet.
I completely agree. So for all of you listening, the next time you find yourself using a new piece of technology, ask yourself, what values are embedded in this technology? And are those values aligned with my own? Because the future of technology is not something that just happens to us. It's something we all have a say in shaping.
I love that. We all have a responsibility and an opportunity to build a better future, one line of code at a time.
And I said it better myself. That's it for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey. Until next time, keep those questions coming and keep those minds open.